The most dangerous failure is not when a machine breaks. It is when everyone believes they already know why. The M1 Abrams sat motionless beneath the morning sun like a giant made of steel that had suddenly forgotten how to move. Heat shimmered above the armored hull. Maintenance crews surrounded the vehicle. Laptops glowed. Diagnostic cables stretched across the concrete. Engineers moved from station to station carrying tablets, technical manuals, and growing frustration. Yet nothing changed. The tank remained silent. At Fort Ridgeline, Arizona, that silence was becoming a problem no one wanted to explain. The demonstration was less than 24 hours away. Senior military leaders, defense officials, and invited guests were scheduled to arrive from across the country. The M1 Abrams was supposed to be the centerpiece of the event. Instead, it had become the center of a crisis. Ryan Brooks stood beside the tank with his arms crossed. At 27 years old, he was one of the youngest lead systems engineers on the installation. His reputation had been built on solving difficult technical problems quickly. He trusted data. He trusted software. He trusted systems. Most of all, he trusted that every problem had a modern solution. That confidence was beginning to crack. A technician climbed down from the vehicle and removed a headset. "Nothing," he said. Ryan frowned. "Run it again." "We already did." "Run it again." The technician nodded reluctantly and disappeared back into the maintenance area. Nearby, Captain Emily Carter watched the growing tension unfold. She had spent most of the morning coordinating schedules and logistics. Now nearly every conversation on the base seemed to revolve around one tank. The massive machine had passed inspections only days earlier. There were no obvious signs of damage. No warning indicators that explained the failure. Yet every attempt to restore full operation ended exactly the same way. Silence. The desert wind pushed across the motor pool. Dust drifted between rows of vehicles. Sunlight reflected from steel surfaces and maintenance shelters. Mechanics continued working without pause. The ticking clock was becoming impossible to ignore. Ryan opened another diagnostic report on his tablet. Numbers filled the screen. Sensor readings. Performance logs. Historical data. Everything pointed in different directions. Nothing pointed toward a solution. "This does not make sense," one engineer muttered. "The system says everything should work." Ryan looked up from the screen. "Machines do not care what should happen. They care what is happening." The words sounded confident. Inside, he felt something else. Concern. Across the maintenance yard, a senior officer exited a command vehicle and headed toward the engineering team. Conversations immediately quieted. The officer stopped beside Ryan and looked at the silent tank. "Status." Ryan hesitated for only a second. "We are still investigating." The officer glanced toward the vehicle. "You have until tomorrow morning." Then he walked away. The message was simple. Failure was not an option. As the day continued, more specialists arrived. More equipment appeared. More theories were tested. Hours passed beneath the Arizona sun. The tank never responded. By late afternoon, frustration hung over the motor pool like a storm cloud. Engineers who normally trusted their expertise had begun questioning themselves. Even the most experienced technicians were running out of ideas. Captain Carter watched Ryan staring at the motionless vehicle. He looked exhausted. For the first time all day, uncertainty showed on his face. The giant machine remained exactly where it had been that morning. Silent, unmoving, waiting. And somewhere beyond the gates of Fort Ridgeline, a forgotten tank veteran was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon when the atmosphere inside the maintenance command center shifted from concern to desperation. The large digital countdown mounted on the wall displayed less than 18 hours until the demonstration. Every person in the room knew exactly what that meant. The silent tank sitting outside was no longer just a maintenance issue. It was becoming a public embarrassment waiting to happen. Ryan Brooks stood before a conference table covered with reports, diagnostic summaries, and technical diagrams. Several engineers surrounded him. Their faces showed the same expression. Exhaustion. One by one, every proposed solution had failed. Every test had produced more questions than answers. A projector displayed system data across the far wall. Green indicators filled the screen. According to the software, the vehicle should have been functioning normally. According to reality, it was not. Captain Emily Carter entered carrying a fresh folder. She placed it on the table. Another engineering team just reviewed the logs. Ryan looked up hopefully. And Emily shook her head. Same conclusion. Ryan exhaled slowly. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Outside the command center windows, the desert sky had begun turning orange. The fading sunlight reflected across rows of military vehicles parked throughout the motor pool. The stillness of the M1 Abrams somehow felt even heavier now. Finally, one of the senior technicians leaned back in his chair. Maybe we are looking at this the wrong way. Ryan folded his arms. Meaning? The technician hesitated. Meaning maybe the problem is not in the data. Ryan frowned immediately. Everything is in the data. Several people nodded in agreement. The technician looked unconvinced but said nothing further. The room fell quiet again. Then an older maintenance supervisor cleared his throat. There is another possibility. Ryan glanced toward him. What possibility? The supervisor shifted slightly before answering. Years ago, there was a tank commander who used to consult on unusual mechanical issues. Ryan stared at him. Consult. Unofficially. A few engineers exchanged confused looks. Who? Ryan asked. The supervisor opened a notebook. Walter Hayes. The reaction was immediate. Several younger engineers looked puzzled. Others smiled faintly. Ryan actually laughed. You are serious? Very. You want us to bring in an 82-year-old retired tanker? The supervisor remained calm. I am saying he has solved problems before. Ryan shook his head. This is a fourth-generation combat vehicle. We have advanced diagnostics, integrated systems analysis, and engineers trained specifically for this platform. His voice grew sharper. We do not need folklore. A few people quietly chuckled. The supervisor did not. Emily Carter noticed the exchange carefully. Who is Walter Hayes? She asked. The room grew quieter. The older supervisor looked toward her. Most people here have never heard of him. Then tell us. He paused before speaking. 40 years ago, if a tank crew could not explain a mechanical problem, somebody eventually called Walter. Ryan leaned back in his chair. And what did he do? Usually fixed it. More laughter followed. Ryan rubbed his forehead. We are discussing a multimillion-dollar armored vehicle, not an old pickup truck. The supervisor closed his notebook. Suit yourself. Nobody pursued the conversation further. The meeting continued. More reports appeared. More theories emerged. Nothing worked. Hours later, after darkness settled across the desert, Ryan stood alone outside beside the motionless tank. Floodlights illuminated the steel hull. Warm evening air moved through the maintenance yard. The giant machine remained silent. Behind him, Captain Carter exited the building carrying her phone. She stopped several yards away. The general just called. Ryan turned toward her. What did he say? Emily looked back at the tank before answering. He wants another option. Ryan frowned. What option? Emily's expression remained unreadable. The old tanker. For the first time that day, nobody laughed. The call came just after 9 that evening. Walter Hayes was sitting on the wooden porch of a modest house outside Tucson, Arizona, when the phone rang. The desert air had cooled. Crickets filled the darkness beyond the porch light. A half-finished cup of coffee rested beside an old leather tool bag that looked almost as weathered as the man himself. Walter stared at the phone for a moment before answering. He rarely received calls after sunset. Most people who knew him understood that. Walter Hayes. His voice was calm and steady. A pause followed. Then another voice answered. Walter listened without interrupting. He occasionally glanced toward the darkness beyond his yard. Finally, he nodded once. I see. Another pause. Tomorrow morning? The answer came through the receiver. Walter looked down at the old leather bag. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. All right. The call ended. He placed the phone on the table and sat quietly for several seconds. There was no excitement, no urgency, only a thoughtful silence. Then he reached down and rested one hand on the worn leather bag. The bag had traveled thousands of miles over the course of his life. Its surface carried scratches, faded stitching, and marks left by decades of use. Walter opened it carefully. Inside were simple tools. Nothing expensive, nothing modern, yet each item had a place. Each carried a memory. He closed the bag and prepared for the next day. Back at Fort Ridgeline, floodlights illuminated the motor pool throughout the night. Engineers continued working around the motionless tank. Ryan Brooks refused to leave. Empty coffee cups gathered beside his workstation. New diagnostic reports filled the screen in front of him. The numbers remained unchanged. Every test led back to the same mystery. Across the maintenance yard, Captain Emily Carter watched technicians moving between equipment stations. Something about the situation bothered her. Not the tank itself. The reaction whenever Walter Hayes was mentioned. Older personnel seemed to recognize the name immediately. Younger personnel did not. The contrast felt important. Shortly before midnight, she located the maintenance supervisor who had first suggested calling Walter. He was reviewing paperwork inside a small office near the motor pool. Emily stepped inside. "Can I ask you something?" The supervisor looked up. "Of course." "Who exactly is Walter Hayes?" The older man leaned back in his chair. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he smiled slightly. "That depends on who you ask." Emily waited. "I am asking you." He folded his hands. 40 years ago, there were people who could diagnose a tank by listening to it for 10 seconds. Emily raised an eyebrow. "That sounds exaggerated." "Most stories do." He glanced toward the silent vehicle outside. "The difference is that some of them happen to be true." Emily looked through the office window toward the floodlit tank. "You really think he can help?" The supervisor shrugged. "I think tomorrow we find out." The night passed slowly. By sunrise, the countdown clock showed less than 9 hours remaining. Tension had settled over the base like a layer of dust. The M1 Abrams remained silent. Engineers moved with growing urgency. Officers monitored schedules. Nobody seemed optimistic anymore. Then, shortly after 7 in the morning, a dusty pickup truck rolled through the gate. It was older than most vehicles on the installation. The truck crossed the motor pool and came to a stop near the maintenance area. Conversations slowed. Technicians looked up. Ryan glanced away from his workstation. The driver's door opened. An 82-year-old man stepped out carrying a worn leather bag. He looked neither impressed nor intimidated by the military activity surrounding him. He simply closed the truck door and adjusted the strap on the bag. Captain Carter watched from several yards away. Something immediately felt different. Walter Hayes did not look like a man arriving to prove anything. He looked like a man arriving to listen. Walter Hayes stood beside the motionless tank for nearly a full minute without saying a word. Around him, engineers waited impatiently. Technicians watched from maintenance platforms. Officers monitored the scene from a distance. The Arizona sun was already climbing higher, and with every passing minute the pressure on the base increased. Yet Walter seemed completely unaffected by the urgency surrounding him. His attention remained fixed on the vehicle. Ryan Brooks folded his arms and studied the older man carefully. This was not what he had expected. No laptop. No diagnostic equipment. No technical team. Just an 82-year-old veteran carrying a worn leather bag. Ryan glanced toward Captain Emily Carter. "This is the solution?" Emily kept her eyes on Walter. "Apparently the general thinks he deserves a chance." Ryan looked back toward the tank. "Wonderful." Walter slowly walked around the vehicle. His boots moved across the concrete at an unhurried pace. He examined the tracks, the suspension, the rear compartment, the turret. Occasionally he stopped and rested one hand against the armor, not to inspect it, almost as if greeting an old acquaintance. Several younger engineers exchanged confused looks. One technician whispered, "What exactly is he doing?" Nobody answered. Walter eventually stopped beside an access panel. He leaned forward slightly and listened. The action immediately drew puzzled expressions. Ryan shook his head. "He is listening to it?" Emily noticed the irritation in his voice. "Maybe." Ryan laughed softly. "The tank is not even running." Walter continued his slow inspection. He never opened a computer, never requested technical data, never asked to review reports. The engineering team had spent almost an entire day analyzing software and systems. Walter had not looked at a single screen. That fact alone irritated Ryan more than he cared to admit. After several minutes, Walter approached the maintenance crew. "Would somebody mind cycling the startup sequence?" The lead technician blinked. "That is all." Walter nodded. "For now." The technician looked toward Ryan. Ryan shrugged. "Go ahead." Moments later, switches activated. Systems powered on. Indicator lights illuminated across the vehicle. Everyone watched. The startup process began exactly as it had dozens of times before. Then the sequence stalled. Silence followed. The same failure. The same result. Several engineers immediately returned their attention to tablets and data screens. Walter did not. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly. The maintenance yard grew quiet around him. Wind moved across the concrete. Equipment rattled softly somewhere nearby. Then Walter opened his eyes again. One more time. Ryan stared. You heard something? Walter looked at him. I heard several things. Ryan frowned. From a failed startup sequence. Walter's expression remained calm. Every machine talks. A few technicians exchanged amused glances. Ryan rubbed his forehead. Machines do not talk. Walter adjusted the strap on his leather bag. That depends on how long you spend listening. The second startup sequence began. Once again, the systems activated. Once again, the process stopped. Walter remained completely focused. This time his eyes moved toward a specific section near the rear of the vehicle. Only for a moment. Then he nodded slightly to himself. Captain Carter noticed it immediately. Ryan did not. Walter walked toward the rear compartment and placed one hand lightly against the armor. The metal felt warm beneath the desert sun. For several seconds he stood there without moving. Then he smiled faintly. Not because he had solved the problem. Because something about the sound reminded him of another morning decades earlier. Another tank. Another desert. Another crew. The memory disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Walter turned back toward the engineers. Interesting, he said quietly. Ryan crossed his arms again. What is interesting? Walter looked once more at the silent vehicle. The tank is telling us exactly what is wrong. Around him, nobody understood what he meant. But for the first time since arriving at Fort Ridgeline, Walter Hayes looked genuinely interested. Walter Hayes kept his hand resting against the armor for another moment before stepping back. Around him, engineers waited for an explanation. None came. Instead, he walked slowly toward a shaded maintenance shelter and sat down on a nearby crate. The reaction was immediate. Ryan Brooks stared in disbelief. That is it, he asked. Walter looked up. For now. Ryan glanced toward Captain Emily Carter. We have less than 8 hours remaining. Walter nodded calmly. I am aware. Ryan opened his hands in frustration. Then why are we sitting here? Walter's eyes moved toward the silent vehicle. Because I already heard what I needed to hear. The answer only deepened the confusion. Nearby technicians exchanged uncertain looks. To them, the tank had produced nothing useful. No obvious clue. No warning message. No clear failure indicator. Yet Walter appeared completely unconcerned. A warm desert wind drifted through the maintenance yard. The smell of heated metal mixed with traces of fuel and dust carried across the concrete. Walter closed his eyes briefly. The scent alone was enough to unlock a memory. Suddenly the maintenance yard disappeared. In its place came another landscape. Another decade. Endless desert stretching beneath a pale sky. Heat waves rising from the ground. The smell of fuel lingering in the air. Walter was young again. His hands carried none of the age visible today. Around him stood members of his tank crew. Some were checking equipment. Others sat in the shade sharing coffee and stories while waiting for orders. Their vehicle had developed a strange problem that morning. Nothing serious. Nothing obvious. Just a sound. A small inconsistency hidden beneath normal operation. Most people never would have noticed it. Walter had. He remembered standing beside the vehicle with one ear near the rear compartment while others thought he was imagining things. He remembered a crewman laughing. You can hear that. Walter had smiled. Something is different. Hours later, they discovered a tiny mechanical issue hidden deep within the system. It was exactly where the sound had pointed. The memory faded as quickly as it arrived. Walter opened his eyes. The present returned. The maintenance yard. The engineers. The silent tank. Some things changed with technology. Others never did. Captain Carter approached quietly. You remembered something. Walter looked at her. What makes you say that? You smiled. Walter glanced toward the vehicle again. Machines have personalities. Emily laughed softly. I do not think the engineers would agree. Most people do not spend enough time with them. Across the yard, Ryan continued reviewing diagnostic reports. He wanted facts, data, measurements. Every instinct told him the solution had to be buried somewhere inside the numbers. Yet despite everything he knew, the tank remained silent. Meanwhile, the old veteran sitting under a maintenance shelter seemed more confident than anyone present. That contradiction bothered him. Walter eventually stood and picked up his leather bag. He walked back toward the vehicle. This time his attention focused on a specific section near the rear compartment. He studied it carefully without touching anything. Then he looked toward the maintenance crew. I need a ladder. Ryan lowered his tablet. Several engineers looked up. The request immediately attracted attention. A technician rolled a ladder into position beside the vehicle. Walter climbed slowly until he reached the area he wanted to inspect. He leaned forward and listened again. Not for long. Only a few seconds. Then he nodded. The movement was small, but Captain Carter noticed it instantly. Walter climbed back down and looked directly at Ryan. For the first time since arriving, his voice carried complete certainty. The problem is not where your computers are searching. Ryan stared at him. Then where is it? Walter adjusted the strap on his leather bag. The faint smile returned. That is what I am about to show you. The maintenance yard had become unusually quiet. Word had spread quickly across Fort Ridgeline that the retired tanker had found something no one else could see. Engineers gathered near the vehicle. Technicians stood on maintenance platforms. Officers watched from shaded observation points. Even people with no direct connection to the problem had begun finding reasons to remain nearby. Everyone wanted to know what Walter Hayes had discovered. Walter set his leather bag on the concrete and slowly opened it. Ryan Brooks expected sophisticated equipment, specialized tools, something unusual. Instead, Walter removed a small flashlight, a worn inspection mirror, and a pair of work gloves. Ryan stared at the items. That is what you need. Walter looked at him calmly. That is what I brought. Several technicians exchanged glances. The contrast between millions of dollars in diagnostic equipment and the contents of the old leather bag was impossible to ignore. Walter climbed the ladder again and moved toward the section he had been studying. This time he used the inspection mirror to look into a narrow area partially hidden behind protective components. He remained there for nearly a minute. Nobody spoke. Wind pushed across the motor pool. The metallic ticking of cooling equipment echoed from nearby vehicles. Finally, Walter climbed back down. There. He pointed toward a specific location. Engineers immediately moved closer. Ryan stepped forward. What exactly are we looking at? Walter handed him the inspection mirror. A mounting bracket. Ryan frowned. We already inspected every bracket. Not that one. Ryan examined the area carefully. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then his expression changed. The bracket was slightly misaligned. Barely noticeable. A fraction of an inch. Most people would never have seen it. Yet the small shift had altered the position of a connected component enough to create a problem that the diagnostic systems could not properly identify. Ryan looked back toward Walter. That caused all of this. Walter nodded. Not by itself. He pointed toward another nearby section. The vibration moved it over time. Several technicians immediately began reviewing the area. One of them looked up moments later. He is right. Another technician checked the maintenance history. There was a component replacement 3 months ago. Walter smiled faintly. That would explain it. Ryan stared at the old veteran. You heard that. Walter looked toward the tank. I heard what was missing. Before Ryan could respond, a convoy entered the motor pool. Vehicles stopped near the observation area. Officers immediately straightened. Doors opened. General Marcus Donovan stepped out and began walking toward the maintenance site. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations ended. The general approached with several senior officers following close behind. His eyes moved first toward the tank, then toward Walter Hayes. The moment he saw him, his expression changed. Recognition appeared immediately. Genuine recognition. Walter noticed it as well. General. The general smiled. Walter Hayes. Several engineers looked back and forth between them. Ryan sensed something important had just happened. General Donovan extended his hand. Walter shook it. It has been a long time, the general said. Too long, Walter replied. The general glanced toward the maintenance activity around the vehicle. I heard they finally called the right person. A few officers quietly laughed. Ryan did not. He was still staring at the inspection mirror in his hand. General Donovan looked toward the tank and then back at Walter. Did you find it? Walter nodded. I believe so. The general smiled again. You always did. Around them, technicians continued preparing the repair. The demonstration deadline was approaching rapidly. Yet for the first time in nearly 2 days, optimism had returned to the maintenance yard. Ryan watched the interaction carefully. The general was not treating Walter like a retired civilian. He was treating him like someone whose name already carried weight. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, Ryan realized he knew almost nothing about the man standing beside him. Technicians moved quickly once the source of the problem had been identified. Ladders were repositioned. Access panels were opened. Maintenance crews gathered around the specific section Walter Hayes had pointed out. The atmosphere inside the motor pool felt completely different now. 24 hours earlier, Uncertainty had dominated every conversation. Now people were working with purpose. Ryan Brooks stood beside the vehicle watching the repair unfold. He still struggled to accept what had happened. Hundreds of pages of diagnostics had failed to reveal the issue. Advanced software had missed it. Teams of engineers had overlooked it. Yet an 82-year-old veteran carrying a leather bag had found it after listening to the tank for only a few minutes. The realization was difficult to ignore. Nearby, General Marcus Donovan and Walter stood beneath a maintenance shelter, watching the work continue. The general folded his arms. "You know," he said, "they still talk about that maintenance exercise in California." Walter smiled faintly. "That was a long time ago. Not for the people who were there." Walter looked toward the tank. "People remember the stories. They forget the details." The general laughed quietly. "The details are usually the reason the stories exist." Captain Emily Carter stood close enough to hear part of the conversation. The more she listened, the more curious she became. There was history between these two men. Significant history. Yet Walter carried it as casually as someone discussing the weather. A technician suddenly climbed down from the vehicle and approached the maintenance supervisor. "Adjustment is complete." The supervisor nodded. "Verify everything." The technician returned to work. Ryan stepped toward Walter. For the first time since the veteran arrived, his voice carried genuine respect. "How did you know where to look?" Walter studied the vehicle before answering. "I did not know." Ryan frowned. "Then how did you find it?" Walter smiled. "I listened." Several nearby technicians laughed softly. Ryan did not. He wanted a real answer. Walter saw the expression on his face. "Most people hear noise," he said. "Experience teaches you to hear differences." Ryan looked toward the tank. "From a startup sequence?" "From thousands of startup sequences." The words settled heavily in the warm desert air. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Ryan slowly nodded. He was beginning to understand. Not completely, but enough to realize the difference between knowledge and mastery. An hour later, the repair was finished. The maintenance crews stepped away. The area around the vehicle cleared. Engineers gathered near monitoring stations. Officers watched from observation points. Even personnel working elsewhere on the base seemed to find reasons to stop and observe. General Donovan looked toward the lead technician. "Whenever you are ready." The technician acknowledged the order. The startup procedure began. Electrical systems activated. Indicator lights illuminated throughout the vehicle. Screens came alive. The familiar sequence unfolded exactly as it had many times before. Ryan felt tension building in his chest. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Every eye remained fixed on the machine. Seconds passed. Then more seconds. This time the sequence continued beyond the point where it had always failed. Technicians exchanged quick glances. Systems progressed normally. Another stage completed successfully. The silence across the motor pool became almost overwhelming. Then it happened. A deep mechanical rumble moved through the vehicle. The sound grew stronger, steadier, confident. The giant machine had awakened. For a brief moment, nobody reacted. The success felt almost unreal. Then smiles appeared. Technicians looked at one another. Engineers exhaled in relief. A few people actually applauded. Ryan stared at the tank in disbelief. The machine stood fully operational beneath the Arizona sun. Everything worked. The impossible problem was gone. Across the motor pool, Walter Hayes simply adjusted the strap on his old leather bag. The expression on his face never changed. He looked less like a man celebrating a victory and more like a man who had expected the result all along. General Donovan watched him and smiled. Around them, people were celebrating a repaired tank. The general knew they were witnessing something much rarer. They were witnessing mastery. The deep mechanical rumble continued rolling across the motor pool long after the startup sequence completed. Engineers stood smiling beside monitoring stations. Technicians exchanged handshakes. Officers who had spent nearly 2 days managing a growing crisis finally allowed themselves to relax. The demonstration was back on schedule. The vehicle was fully operational. Yet as the excitement spread through Fort Ridgeline, General Marcus Donovan noticed something interesting. The center of attention was quietly walking away. Walter Hayes had already closed his leather bag. While others discussed reports and repair procedures, he moved toward the edge of the maintenance area as though his work was finished. In his mind, it was. Captain Emily Carter saw him first. "You are leaving?" Walter stopped and looked back. "Looks like you all have things under control now." Emily smiled. You just solved a problem nobody else could solve. Walter shrugged. The tank helped. She laughed softly. That answer is becoming a habit. Walter offered the faint smile she had seen several times that day. Nearby, Ryan Brooks remained standing beside the vehicle. The startup sequence was still running smoothly. Every system check returned normal results. The data finally matched reality. Yet he found himself looking less at the tank and more at the old veteran preparing to leave. The contrast felt impossible to ignore. For 2 days Ryan had trusted software, diagnostics, and technical reports. Walter had trusted experience. Somehow experience had won. General Donovan approached before Walter could leave the motor pool. Several officers followed behind him. The conversations around the maintenance area gradually quieted as people noticed the general changing direction. Walter stopped. General. Donovan looked around at the gathered personnel. Engineers, technicians, officers, mechanics. Many had spent the entire day watching the veteran work. Most still had no idea who he really was. The general folded his hands behind his back. I think there is something these people should know. Walter immediately shook his head. That is not necessary. The general smiled. Which is exactly why it is. A few people laughed quietly. Ryan stepped closer. So did Emily. Curiosity spread through the group. General Donovan looked toward the repaired vehicle. 43 years ago, before many of you were born, a young tank commander earned a reputation across multiple training commands. Walter lowered his eyes slightly. The general continued anyway. Whenever crews encountered a mechanical issue nobody could explain, they called one person. Several engineers exchanged glances. Ryan already knew where this was going. That person was Walter Hayes. Silence followed. The general looked directly at the gathered personnel. Not because he had special equipment. Not because he had special authority. Because he understood machines better than anyone else I ever met. The wind moved across the maintenance yard. Sunlight reflected from the steel hull behind them. Walter looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. People exaggerate over time, he said. General Donovan shook his head. Not this. He pointed toward the tank. You just proved it. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. Ryan certainly did not. He remembered every skeptical comment he had made since hearing Walter's name. Each one felt heavier now. The old veteran noticed him standing there. Their eyes met briefly. Ryan expected judgment. Instead, Walter simply nodded. The gesture carried no bitterness, no satisfaction, only kindness. Somehow that made the lesson even stronger. Around them, the repaired vehicle continued operating flawlessly. Engineers returned to work. Technicians completed final inspections. The crisis was over. Yet the story people would remember was no longer about a malfunctioning machine. It was about a man carrying a worn leather bag who arrived without boasting, listened when others talked, and reminded an entire base that technology evolves every year, but wisdom takes a lifetime to earn. As the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the concrete, Walter Hayes picked up his bag once more. The demonstration had been saved. The tank was awake. And the most important lesson of the day had nothing to do with machinery at all. Walter Hayes reached his pickup truck just as the afternoon sun began settling lower over the Arizona horizon. The heat was softening. Long shadows stretched across the motor pool. Behind him, the repaired tank continued operating flawlessly while technicians completed final checks for the next day's demonstration. The crisis that had consumed the base for nearly 2 days was over. Yet Walter moved with the same quiet pace he had carried all morning. No celebration, no victory speech, no desire for recognition. He placed the leather bag on the passenger seat and paused before opening the door. Walter. He turned. Ryan Brooks was walking toward him. The young engineer looked different than he had 24 hours earlier. The confidence remained, but something else had joined it. Humility. Ryan stopped a few feet away. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to begin. Then he finally spoke. I owe you an apology. Walter smiled gently. For what? Ryan let out a small breath. For assuming I already knew everything worth knowing. Walter looked toward the maintenance yard. Engineers continued moving around the vehicle. The sound of preparation drifted across the base. That happens to all of us. Ryan shook his head. Not like this. He glanced toward the tank. I spent 2 days staring at data. You spent a few minutes listening. Walter rested one hand on the truck door. The data was important. Ryan laughed softly. That sounds generous. It is true. Walter's voice remained calm. Experience without information can make mistakes. Information without experience can do the same. The best results happen when both work together. Ryan nodded slowly. The lesson was simple, yet somehow it carried more weight than any technical training course he had ever attended. Nearby, Captain Emily Carter approached as well. "Before you leave," she said, "there is something you should see." Walter followed her gaze toward the maintenance yard. General Donovan stood beside the repaired vehicle with several officers. As Walter approached, the conversations gradually faded. The general looked around at the assembled personnel. Engineers, technicians, mechanics, officers. Many had remained long after their shifts ended. "Tomorrow," the general said, "our guests will see an impressive machine." His eyes moved toward the tank. "But today, I hope all of you witness something even more valuable." Nobody spoke. The wind moved gently across the motor pool. Technology changes, the general continued. Systems improve. Equipment evolves. But mastery never becomes obsolete. Several people glanced toward Walter. The veteran immediately looked uncomfortable with the attention. General Donovan smiled. "That lesson was worth more than any demonstration we could possibly schedule." The silence that followed felt different from the silence surrounding the broken tank. This silence carried respect. Genuine respect. Ryan noticed it. Emily noticed it. Everyone present noticed it. Walter simply nodded once. Nothing more was needed. A few minutes later, he climbed into the pickup truck. The engine started. The old vehicle rolled slowly toward the exit gate. No escort followed him. No ceremony accompanied his departure. He left the same way he had arrived, quietly. Yet as the truck disappeared beyond the base perimeter, many people remained standing exactly where they were, watching, thinking, remembering. Ryan stood beside the repaired tank long after Walter was gone. The machine worked perfectly now. The reports would be filed. The demonstration would proceed. The problem would eventually become another maintenance case buried in records and archives. But the lesson would stay with him much longer. Some knowledge could be downloaded. Some skills could be taught. And some forms of mastery could only be earned through decades of patience, observation, and experience. As evening settled over Fort Ridgeline, the desert sky turned gold above the silent horizon. The tank stood ready. The base returned to normal. And somewhere on a quiet highway leading home, a forgotten veteran carried with him the same leather bag he had carried for most of his life. He had never come looking for recognition. He had only answered a call for help. And perhaps that was exactly why people would remember him. Technology changes. Mastery remains.